Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 111 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is a podcast where I discuss current events and international news and foreign policy and then give some analysis on those issues. The podcast can be found at thelibertarianinstitute.org on the homepage right under Scott Horton's show on the right hand side, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or the Facebook page Kyle's Files. I am again going to talk about what I am calling the most important issue right now, and that is House Concurrent Resolution 81. House Concurrent Resolution 81 invokes the War Powers Act to prevent the United States from assisting the Saudi-led coalition fighting on their side of the civil war in Yemen. To provide some background as to why this issue is so important, we gotta go back and kind of look at the outbreak of the civil war in Yemen. Arab Spring protests rose up in the Arab Spring protests broke out in Yemen. This eventually led to the resignation of Saleh from power in Yemen in 2011 and then the subsequent election of Hadi in a one-man election organized by Hillary Clinton in the United States in 2012. Hadi was the only name on the ballot for the presidential election, and so while the United States and the State Department touted it as a victory for democracy, that is pretty much unso. Saleh, who was the former leader of the country, the one ousted by the Arab Spring, may have been somewhat unpopular to the population because of all the wars and military actions he waged against them and allowing the United States to carry out raids and drone wars against the people of Yemen. He still had some loyalty in the military and took several army divisions with him. Saleh went to the north of the country along the Saudi border where there's a group of people known as the Zaydi Shias who are part of a political movement known as the Houthis. Saleh, as president, had fought several wars against the Houthis, but it turns out he was actually a Zaydi Shia himself and I guess was welcomed back into that alliance and community once leaving office. Hadi continued many of the same unpopular policies as Saleh and then was weakened by several wars he was fighting against different groups within Yemen, leading to the new Houthi-Saleh coalition being able to take the capital city of Yemen, Sana'a, and force Hadi to flee. Hadi was first forced to flee to the southern port city of Aden, but was eventually forced to go to Saudi Arabia. Once Hadi was forced out of the country and into Saudi Arabia in March of 2015 started a civil war on behalf of Hadi against the Houthi and Saleh united force that held the capital city of Sana'a. The Saudi coalition fighting for Hadi includes several other Arab countries. I believe Egypt is on board, the UAE and Bahrain are on board. Once Qatar was on board, but I don't believe that is any longer the case with Saudi splitting their diplomatic relations with Qatar. Sudan has also been on board and has even provided a good number of mercenaries to the Saudi cause. Hadi himself does not have much, if any, army and really relies on a lot of fighting forces to come from the tribal areas of Yemen as well as al-Qaeda and ISIS. Yemen is of course home to the most dangerous terror network in the world, and that is al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and if there's one network that you have to worry about pulling off kind of a high-scale attack against the West, it would be this network. We're not talking about lone wolf style shootings that have been at least, reported to be encouraged by ISIS, but talking about like 9/11 style hijacking or more involved planned out attacks. Al-Qaeda and ISIS seem to mostly be fighting on the side of Hadi in this war and definitely benefiting from the chaos created by this war. As I've detailed in the past on this show, there is somewhat of a split in the Arab world between the Sunnis and the Shia. The Houthis and Saleh are Shia kind of type of Muslims, although Zaydis aren't exactly Shia like the Iranians are. And of course, al-Qaeda ISIS is the radical Sunni jihadist movement, and so they are natural enemies and have been enemies throughout the civil war. By the United States supporting the Saudi coalition in their war to first blockade the people of Yemen, not letting any ships through. This is mostly the U.S. Navy enforcing this blockade, so preventing food, fuel, medications into Yemen that is desperately needed in a country that before the Civil War even broke out was considered the poorest country in the Middle East and imported around 90% of its food. With the blockade, you literally have millions of people starving and then a lot of people unable to get the fuel and aid they need in order to be able to go to the hospital to ward off diseases like cholera, which is currently an epidemic that will end up affecting over 1 million Yemeni people. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are also carrying out airstrikes against Houthi and Salah targets, although they often hit civilian targets in the north of Yemen, destroying many homes, killing entire families, bombing funerals, weddings, schools, markets, water treatment facilities, factories, just about anything that the Yemeni population, at least of northern Yemen, had to offer the world or just used to support each other. Roads, bridges, hospitals, ambulances have all been destroyed by the Saudi-led campaign. The U.S. is supporting the Saudi-led campaign in the air by providing mid-air refueling to the fighters, which is desperately important for the Saudis. Because of where the Saudis' air base is, I believe, which is around Mecca and Medina, they don't have a whole lot of time over the air in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, where Houthis and Salah mostly exist. And without the U.S. mid-air refueling, they wouldn't be able to hover over the cities for hours like they do now, hitting strikes multiple times, and I guess from their perspective, carrying out a more healthy and better air war. And then the U.S. provides them with intelligence and the weapons necessary. The Saudis have dropped so many bombs on Yemen now that they would have bombed themselves out of bombs had the United States not stopped their supplies so many times. It was Barack Obama who started the U.S. involvement in this war. Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, explained that the United States was supporting the Saudi-led war in Yemen to placate Saudi Arabia because the Saudis were worried about the United States having closer diplomatic relations with the United States. In the wake of the nuclear agreement, Saudi Arabia also cites Iranian influence amongst the Houthis as a reason Saudi Arabia wants to fight the war against the Houthis in Yemen. However, the ties between the Houthis and Iran are largely overblown. While Iran has probably provided the Houthis with some small weapons, any type of claims that Iran has provided huge amounts of weapons to the Houthis that has allowed them to continue the war is completely untrue. Yemen, prior to all this engagement, was already awash with weapons, largely from, I believe Yemen was split between the north and south around the time of the Cold War, the south being commies, and so there was some, a large amount of Soviet weapons existing in Yemen prior to this. In fact, a lot of the time that the Houthis are able to launch weapons against Saudi Arabia, they're ballistic missiles that are converted Scud missiles, provided to who knows what past leader of South Yemen when they were split in Cold War times by the Soviet Union, of course. So what House Concurrent Resolution 81 will do is it will stop the United States from providing all the support to Saudi Arabia and allowing them to continue bombing all these poor people in Yemen. Like I said, this part of the United States war in Yemen is at no uncertain terms benefiting al-Qaeda and ISIS in the country. The United States is also fighting on the other side of the civil war too, carrying out raids and airstrikes against ISIS and al-Qaeda targets in Yemen. The most famous recent example would be the day after Trump took office, we had that big raid in Yemen where we had an 8-year-old American girl get shot in the neck. So anybody who's freaking out saying, oh, if we withdraw from Yemen, the terrorists will, expand and get more dangerous, as the war hawks and neocons always love to say, this is completely 100% untrue. If anything, the United States withdrawing their support to the Saudi-led campaign will help the United States fight their terror war. The other, I think, argument you're really gonna bump into is Iranian influence, of course. I already kind of explained how this really isn't the case. Remember, the Iranians told the Houthis, going back, I believe, around 2012, 2013, not to take the capital city of Sana'a from Hadi, and said just, kind of fight Hadi's army back, but you guys really don't have a reason to go in there, because if you do this is going to upset the Saudis, and then the U.S. is going to get involved. And Barack Obama himself acknowledged this at the time. And so, as you can see, that the ties between the Houthis and Iran are really limited. And while they'll try to portray the Houthis as a mini Hezbollah, that is just not the case. From the left, you may have this idea of responsibility to protect, which of course was kind of the Obama foreign policy doctrine that led the United States to intervene in Libya. The idea is that if the people are suffering under a leader, the United States has a responsibility to protect those people. But of course, in Yemen, the United States war, especially on this side of the war, the side of the war where the United States is carrying out the blockade and the airstrikes, is devastating the people of Yemen. You have over 14 million people in Yemen food insecure. hundreds of thousands of Yemeni children acutely malnourished. You have thousands of people starving to death whose bodies aren't being counted because they have no ability to reach a hospital, and that's the only place where the bodies are being counted. Yemeni journalist who's based in Sana'a, Nasser Arabi, has explained that he believes that 60,000 plus people have died solely from the conflict in Yemen. This isn't talking about people who have starved to death or died of cholera. The UN continues to cite this 10,000 deaths number, saying that only a small fraction more have died from the Saudi side of the war over the Houthi side of the war. However, the UN is only counting the bodies that make it to the hospital, and with Saudi Arabia having destroyed so many hospitals, roads, and bridges, many people's bodies are never being counted. And so who knows what the total death toll is in Yemen. Like I said, a lot of people will just never be counted, but it does sound like we're kind of reaching that critical point where the starvation numbers are going to spike, the number of people dying of cholera is going to spike, and if Saudi Arabia continues their air war, people will continue to die from that as well. So what can you do? Everybody could call their congressman, their representative, and tell them to support House Concurrent Resolution 81, and that will invoke the War Powers Act and tell Donald Trump he cannot fight this war. Now, this will not affect in any way the war against al-Qaeda and ISIS, because that is apparently being justified under the 2001 AUMF, even though al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS were both started after 2001. Now, some of you may be nervous about supporting anything that invokes the War Powers Act, because the War Powers Act has always been portrayed as a way that the government gets away with war. However, what the War Powers Act actually says is that the United States cannot launch an offensive war no matter what, and this is completely an offensive war, so the United States will have to knock it off immediately. This bill has real potential to move along. It's already up to 38 co-sponsors, and for those of you who could take the time to call, it makes a difference. So everybody, if you pick up your phone right now and call and say, hey, to your representative, you really have to support and at least vote for it, but if they can, even co-sponsor House Concurrent Resolution 81. There are some Republicans on board. Thomas Massey, Walter Jones, and Raul Labrador have all signed on to support this bill. And there's 35 Democrats. I believe Catherine Clark, my representative, has now signed on. I saw Representative Lee, Representative Jadson Lee, Representative Waters, the more progressive type representatives has all signed on as well. So this looks like, there is some potential here for this to really at least gain some traction, if not actually pass. So let's all take a couple minutes and some time, and maybe we could end a war. Now I'll get on to the rest of the news that's been coming up. We have Raytheon winning a $1.5 billion contract to provide support to the United States in the maintenance of some U.S. aircraft. I'd like to discuss a Harvard-Harris poll that I talked about on the last show. What the poll results said is that 70% of Americans supported renegotiating the Iranian nuclear agreement. However, that wasn't the case. What the pollsters did is they asked a hypothetical question, which was, if Iran was violating the nuclear deal, should the United States renegotiate the nuclear deal or do nothing about it? In that case, 70% of Americans said they should renegotiate the nuclear deal, while 30% said let Iran keep violating the deal. And so that is a far cry from what the poll was portrayed as being, which was just the amount of Americans who support the Trump plan to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. So anybody who's citing that poll as a reason for saying, hey, Trump has popular support on this one, no, he doesn't. We have a Virginia man who traveled to the Middle East and was busted in Syria, I guess attempting to fight for ISIS, being sentenced to 20 years in jail. The big news out of Catalonia over the weekend is that the Spanish government said that they were dissolving several positions within the Catalonian government, including the Prime Minister, the Parliament, the President's Cabinet, and the police chief of the Catalan Police. There are some reports that several members of the President's envoy has gone to Belgium looking for, I guess, some refuge there, because the Spanish government is basically charging all these people with sedition and saying that if you stay in the country, I think some of them are facing 30 plus years in jail. I did see that some members of the Catalan government were tweeting out this morning that they were going to work, and it seemed that they had gone there. There's a big meeting today among the Independence Party in Catalonia to decide on where they want to go from here. As far as action, the Spanish government is pushing a December 21st election, in which I guess they're going to try to rig up the election so that the separatists lose and that they could get a Catalan Parliment in there that'll rubber stamp Catalonia remaining part of Spain. In Kuwait, we had the prime minister of the country resigning. In Iran, we had the IAEA Cheif, that is, of course, the agency tasked with monitoring and inspecting Iran to make sure they're complying with the nuclear agreement, saying that Iran is following the nuclear deal. And so, again, while the Trump administration likes to pretend that Iran is violating the deal, complaining that Iran is violating the spirit of the deal, this is 100% incorrect and false. Iran is complying with the deal, and it has pretty significant effects if America goes back on the deal. Of course, the most, I think, significant one, the one I've talked about the most, is that North Korea just isn't going to trust the United States. Why would North Korea sign a deal to get rid of their nuclear weapons if the United States has shown that they're really not going to live up to the deal, and at the first, change of power, they'll bail on the deal, and then North Korea will be in the position that Iran was, where they've given up a whole bunch, and now the United States is saying it's not good enough anyways. In Syria, we have the Syrian kind of coalition, Syria, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, the Shia militaries fighting in Deir Ezzor, pretty heavy, nasty fighting going on there. Right around the city, we have an ISIS enclave still holding on with about 1,500 civilians living there, and Syria and Russia carrying out a pretty heavy and nasty bombing campaign against those people. There are reports of the government bombing boats as they tried to cross the river. Of course, this happened with the United States and how they were carrying out attacks against people trying to flee across the Euphrates River or the Tigris River in Mosul, and then killing a lot of civilians that way with airstrikes. And so these civilians, no matter if they're in areas fighting against the Americans, not fighting against, but just trying to live in areas where either the Americans or the Syrians are bombing, it's nasty either way. Outside Damascus, we had 11 civilians being killed by an airstrike, and then also a school being hit by mortar fire and then being destroyed by the Syrian government. We had the UN releasing their report on the April 4th chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhoun, blaming everything on the Syrian government, but then there being several inconsistencies in that reporting, including several people who are alleged to have been hit by some kind of chemical weapon showing up at the hospital before the chemical weapons attack even occurred. In Iraq, we have the Iraqi Kurdish leader Barzani saying that he will resign on November 1st. Barzani's resignation comes as his push for Kurdish independence has completely failed, and we are now left in a situation in Iraq where there's been some rumored ceasefires between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi government. However, there isn't, a full-scale ceasefire in place quite yet. Last up, we have Afghanistan, where we have a U.S. soldier being killed in a helicopter crash. Of course, the military comes out and says, well, this isn't related to, combat, and he wasn't in combat at the time. However, this wasn't just an American citizen on a helicopter tour of Afghanistan. He was there on military duties. And again, just one of those consequences of if you're going to have these wars all over the world, then you're going to have military, people flying in these helicopters all over the world, and sometimes they crash and sometimes people die because of it. I didn't see any reporter ask, but I guess a very good question will be, is this one the new Black Hawks that crashed? And if so, was it because the Afghani pilot training it wasn't exactly trained on the Black Hawk? The United States, of course, replaced all the old Russian helicopters that the Afghan military is used to using with American-made helicopters. We have two people, probably civilians, being killed at an engagement party by a U.S. bomb. The man who was being engaged, one of the people killed, was a member of the Afghan National Police, of course, fighting on the side of the Americans. And so it's very interesting, and hopefully we'll get some details on how this airstrike was able to take place, where the U.S. was bombing seemingly an civilian event of a ally of the United States in Afghanistan. We have 15 Afghan police being killed by 2 Taliban attacks over the weekend. And we have a total of at least 200 people across Afghanistan being killed by the Taliban in October. And we have the U.S. announcing that they will give additional weapons to Afghanistan. Those are 6 A-29 light attack aircraft. They've already given the Afghan government 20 as long as, I believe 80-something Black Hawk helicopters. Alright, that's where I'll wrap up the show today. Just a reminder, H.Con.Res Resolution 81. Call your representative, have them sign that. or have them co-sponsor and then vote for and support that resolution is very important. The show could be found at the libertarianinstitute.org, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, Kyle's Files, iTunes. Share it all. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE, and the personal website is kylesfilesblog.com. Thanks, everybody.